Hi, my name is Joel Seymour. I'm a pastor at Lancaster Vineyard Church in Lancaster, Ohio. It's southeastern Ohio. I also serve as a area leader for the Vineyard Movement, kind of what you would call like a district superintendent type role, just encouraging pastors within an area. My area is southeastern Ohio, West Virginia, and western Pennsylvania. A lot of small towns in those areas. And out of the 15 churches that I relate to, 7 of the pastors are bivocational. So have some experience with that relationally with those pastors, but I also have experience with bivocational pastoring and planting in my own life. I have planted a church when I was 22 as part of a team, and we went to a small farm town in northwest Ohio surrounded by cornfields, and it was there that we planted and was bivocational during those years, worked as a factory worker first and third shift to eventually becoming fully funded, and was on staff for a couple years there. Then at age 26, moved to Lancaster, kind of the hometown of my wife and I, and we planted there, worked at a music store as a general manager for a couple years while planting and pastoring. So I have some experience doing that. Our church has helped to plant 3 churches in small towns around Ohio and also in western PA, and so now I relate to those pastors. As part of the Vineyard Movement, a Multiply Vineyard, that's the Vineyard church planting movement, the arm of the church planting movement. It's called Multiply Vineyard, and it's there that I'm a part of the small town specialty team where we help equip and encourage planters and pastors who are in small town USA. So doing a lot with them and learning about bivocational planting and pastoring. In fact, that's what we want to talk about today in this session is how to succeed in bivocational planting and pastoring. You know, we often probably come out of Bible college or ministry training school, out of our own churches, having this idea of what pastoring is going to be. We often think about, I'm going to have a full-time job pastoring, I'll be fully funded. And yet the stats show that around 50% of all pastors in America are bivocational. And it gets higher in some movements and in some places in the country. It gets up to 60 or 70%. And then some other places in the country, it's 30 to 40. But across the nation, it's 50%. It's often easy to think that you're a failure if you're not fully funded, because that's kind of what we're geared towards when we're in our training. But the reality is there's a lot of benefits to being bivocational in church planting and in pastoring. If you're watching this and you're going to small town USA or to rural America, bivocational is probably not a choice. It's going to be a necessity. I just want to encourage you right off the front end before we get to some practical ways to meet the challenges of bivocational pastoring. I want to encourage you that there's some benefits to doing this. One of the benefits simply is that it'll reduce the need to fundraise. A lot of times we think about getting a bunch of money together, getting a nest egg before we go plant. It's pretty in vogue in church planting circles to do large launches, which really do work well with certain leaders and in certain areas of the country. But if you're going small town, you most likely aren't doing a large launch. You're not going to be able to take a team to a small town that could have housing or jobs there, and so you're going to be starting off much smaller. Well, a benefit of being bivocational, you're not going to need to do a bunch of fundraising to get there or to do a large launch. Another benefit of being bivocational is it takes the financial pressure off the church. If you're moving to a town, you're trying to get things rolling, you're trying to move towards a public service, that's going to take funding to do the outreach, to do the gathering, to do events, and have space to meet. If you're bivocational, you take some of the financial pressure off your church so that you don't have to get as much each week to be able to fund your salary. If you're part-time with the church, half-time, even quarter-time with the church, it takes that pressure off, and you can use those finances in other areas of church life. Another benefit is you get to fit into and bless the community. So by being bivocational, you're living the life that the very people you're trying to gather are living. And that goes a long way in small town USA, particularly if you're not from there. In small town, people really want to see people contributing to the community. They want to see that you are a part of the community and that you're not just a flash in the pan. You're going to have some longevity. By getting a job in the town and contributing to the needs of that town, then you actually show them that you're a part of the community, and you'll be more quickly accepted. So there's some benefits to doing this bivocational thing. My friend Michael Houle, who pastors in northern Wisconsin, has been bivocational for 11 years in his small town. And he tells me what he has found is that by being bivocational, the people have accepted him much more readily, and he feels like he's contributing to the town, and he gets that feedback from the other townspeople. He was an outsider when he moved there 11 or 12 years ago. He worked at the school, and it has opened up opportunities for him to bless the community, to contribute to the community, and to be accepted. It's also given him great opportunities to gather people for his church plant. So one of the benefits simply is you get to fit into the community more readily and quicker, I believe. Let's move on to some challenges and then some ways to succeed at bivocational church planting. You already know the challenges. If you're already heading there, or if you've studied the town you're moving to, or if you're already pastoring on the ground and planting on the ground, you know these challenges. So I want to hit the challenges fairly quickly, but then give some ideas on how to meet these challenges successfully. One of the first challenges, and I don't know if you've thought about this before, one of the first challenges right out of the gate to being a bivocational planter is the current definition of church success. We live in a world right now, in church world, where big and large is really celebrated. The books that get written are by pastors from large churches. Oftentimes at our denominational conferences, it is pastors from large churches who get to speak. And so very often it can form a view in our own head that the only way we're successful is if we're from a large church. I remember one time taking a church planter that we had sent out. We took him to our national conference, and we were celebrating church plants, which was great. It was a good atmosphere. And then we celebrated people who became established churches. And we used to have a definition of being 100 people in attendance was an established church. And it never occurred to me till I was at that event with him of how that felt to pastors from small towns. He had a church plant of 40 or 50 people, reaching a niche of people who had not been reached in his community, and was doing fairly well. And yet he felt like that he was not a success because he wasn't hitting a certain metric. So one of the challenges you're going to face is the challenge of the definition of church success. Well, how do you meet that challenge? Well, here's a couple ways. I remember when my wife and I were getting ready to plant our second church, and we're being launched out on our own to be the lead pastors of this church. About 6 months before we went out, we began to pray regularly a simple prayer, and it was simply this. It was God, our definition of success is obedience to you. And whatever this thing looks like, as long as we're obedient to you, then we're going to define that as success. We tried to train ourselves, and we talked about it for months before heading there. If this is just 2 or 3 small groups after 5 years, if that's what God wants, then we're going to be okay with that. If it's 100 people after 5 years, 200 people after 5, we'll be okay with that too. But we tried to change the way we thought. Instead of thinking we're going to get to this town and just blow it up and get real big real quick and be prominent in the town and have large Sunday attendance, we just changed the way we thought. We thought, no, this is about being obedient to God. And if He's called you to a small town, then it's unrealistic to think you're going to have 500, 600, 700, 1,000 people. That might be 1/3 of your town's population. You have to change the way you think and begin to think, no, what success is being obedient to God. The other way I think you meet this definition, you meet this challenge of our current definition of church success, the other way you meet that is you begin to think differently about who you're pastoring. See, here's the deal. You have to think like being a parish priest more than a Sunday morning pastor. Because the truth is this, most small town planters and pastors I know, they're actually pastoring way more people than those who show up on Sunday morning. In fact, your parish is probably bigger than a lot of mega churches because it's the population of your town that you're pastoring. So you're pastoring the mayor who goes to church maybe 3 or 4 times a year somewhere else. You're pastoring him or her. You're pastoring the rough around the edges mechanic that works on your car. You're pastoring to your schools, to your school teachers, to the teachers of your kids. You're pastoring them. And what ends up happening as you're pastoring the waitress, as you're pastoring the owner of the mom and pop grocery store, what ends up happening is you end up doing their weddings, you do funerals for their loved ones, you do baby dedications. During times of crisis, they reach out to you. And so you have to begin to change the way you think that the definition of success isn't how many people are showing up on Sunday morning. It's how many are you pastoring. And if you're in a small town, you're pastoring the 1,500 people in that town, the 3,000, the 5,000, and you're known in that town. So begin to think that way when you think about church success. Am I pastoring my parish? Am I pastoring the population of the people in my town? It's not just about Sunday mornings. Well, let's talk about the next challenge that small town bivocational pastors and planters have. And the next challenge is fatigue and poor physical health. Church planting takes a lot of time. Being a bivocational planter often means you aren't just working 2 part-time jobs, but it feels like, and oftentimes hourly it is this, you're working 2 full-time jobs. Well, that begins to take a toll on your physical health. My friend Michael Houle that I talked about earlier, he said this really came to mind for him as he's been pastoring bivocationally for 11 years. He said this came to mind to him at a recent regional conference, and they were doing kind of a funny slideshow of before and after pictures of pastors, like here they were when they started, and here's what they look like now. And he said when that came up on the screen for him, it hit him that he looked way worse now than when he began this journey. And it began to make him think about taking care of his physical health. He said, Joel, it was like looking at before and after pictures of the presidents after they've served for 8 years, just one looks young and vibrant and the other one just looked rough. And he said, I began to take care of my physical health at that time. I have another friend, Dave Jacobs, who coaches between 50 and 70 pastors a month. He's a retired pastor. He pastored for 35 years, mainly in small churches. And he coaches lots of people from lots of different denominations. And he often coaches bivocational pastors. And he says almost every bivocational pastor tells him, he says, I have 2 full-time jobs. I'm working full-time in a mainstream industry to make money for my family, and then I'm pastoring full-time. So I'm doing 2 full-time jobs. And Dave will tell him, okay, but that's going to kill you eventually. And it's true. We all understand it takes a lot of sacrifice to get a church plant off the ground, and those first couple of years are crucial, and there's a lot of time and energy that's put into that. But you have to be careful that you don't sacrifice your health. Because, let's face it, besides the presence of God, the greatest asset your church plant has is you. And so you have to take care of yourself. So I would encourage you, as you're meeting that challenge, schedule in times. You've probably seen the illustration of lots of small gravel and rocks and then a jar and then the big rocks. And the illustration is if you put the small rocks in before the big rocks, you'll never get the big rocks in. You want to make sure your physical health is one of those big rocks you put in first. So it's 2 to 3 times a week getting exercise, taking a hike, taking a walk, working out at the Y. And what I'd encourage you to do is make that a part of your discipleship habits. Don't do that stuff alone. Take somebody that you're discipling with you and use that as a meeting time for them. That's how you fit those kind of things in, is you double up things of like, I'm not going to accomplish 2 things with this workout. I'm going to meet somebody. I'm going to make it a regular part of who I'm discipling. We're going to go for a walk, but I'm also going to get some exercise and take care of my health. Another challenge that we have in bivocational ministry is just less time for ministry. You'll have less time to pastor the people you want to pastor, less time to get involved in crisis situations, and that can be a real tension point for pastors. And we'll talk about that in a little bit about how to meet that need in a real practical way as we go through 3 ways to make a success. You also have limited family time. And if you're pastoring bivocationally, you have limited family time. Now, my wife and I have had a great relationship. We've been married 25 years. But when we were bivocational church planters, it was very difficult and during that time, particularly when we started having kids. And there were several ways we met this challenge. One of the things was early on when I began to take some kind of a salary from the church, even when it was part-time, instead of filling up all that extra time with ministry, we decided to allot some of it for family time. And so in the beginning, it was just maybe an evening or half a day. Eventually, we were able to work it out where I was working a mainstream job 4 days a week and one day, and then doing church planning on the side there. But then 1 day a week, we just said, this is Sabbath and family time. I would encourage you, as quick as you can get to, if it's just an evening, if it's just a half a day, if it's some time that you can allot to your family, that's very important. You know, for the last decade or so, when I have heard the verse that Jesus said, he says, what does it profit a man to gain the whole world and yet lose his soul? Every time I hear that verse, this is what I hear in my head. What does it profit a pastor to gain the whole church world and yet lose his family? And that drives me. because I don't want to lose my family for the sake of church planting or become a successful pastor. So I'd encourage you, even though it's going to be tough to do this, carve out a niche time. Early on in my church planting experience and being bivocational, I was out to save everybody. And I took every phone call. And every phone call tended to turn into a 45-minute counseling session. And it would drive my family nuts. We would drive up and meet with our church planting coach. And he told me a story that I think will help you. He said this. He said, Joel, you can't take every call. You can't pastor every person that calls every time. You're going to have some boundaries. Your family needs you. And he said, early on in my pastorate, I got a call on our family movie night. I had young kids, always had a family movie night. And I knew this gentleman had been having trouble in his marriage for quite a while, and he called me. He said, Danny, you got to come to me right now and talk to me and my wife, or we're done. We're finished. And Danny said, I just told him. I said, you know what? Tonight's my family night, and I'm not going to disappoint my kids. I need to stay home tonight, and we do this every week, and they look forward to it. It's the one night of the week where they know they have their dad's undivided attention. I'll be happy to meet with you tomorrow. I'll be happy to meet with you this weekend. They hung up the phone. He said the next day the guy didn't call the next day, didn't call over the weekend. He saw him at church, and he said, hey, what happened? He said, I thought you had a crisis. We needed to get together. And the guy said, you know what, Danny, what I realized was I've never made my family a priority. And that spoke to me when you said you couldn't meet that night because your kids needed you. On the way home, Christy and I talked about that. And we began to schedule an evening where my kids knew family came first. So I know you don't have a lot of extra time, but one of the big rocks that needs to be in bivocational pastoring is family time, allotted family time. Whether it's an evening or half a day or Sunday afternoons, evening, however you need to schedule it in the rhythm of your life, make that a priority, make that a big rock. Another challenge for bivocational pastoring is connecting with your denominational leaders. Now, you probably already realize this, but fully funded pastors like to meet during the weekdays. They don't meet evenings, and they don't meet weekends. They want to reserve that for things for their church or things for their family or their personal life. But for bivocational pastors, it's awful tough to meet with your denominational leaders or other pastors. Church planting is isolating enough, and then to have that, you really begin to feel isolated from people and your peers. So how do you meet this challenge? How could you begin to meet with other pastors? Well, one way you could begin to feel connected is to connect with other bivocational pastors. Remember I said at least 50% of all pastors in America are bivocational. So one of the ways you meet this challenge is you find 2 other bivocational pastors and you begin to meet with them. In my area, where I said we have 7 bivocational pastors, some of them are beginning to do this. They do it online, with FaceTime and Google Hangouts and Skype. It's easy to meet online. So our bivocational pastors are beginning to meet monthly in groups of 3. And 3 is a real key there. I don't think you just want to meet with one other pastor, because what often can happen if you're both bivocational, one might be succeeding or having more celebrations, one might be having more challenges, and then there's a little bit of tension when you begin to talk. The guy that seems to be having a lot of wins ends up not sharing because they don't want to make the other guy feel bad, and the other guy just feels like each month's meeting is a drag because he just has to hear how good things are at this other church. So I think you want to have 3, because in 3, it balances itself out. So what if, to feel more connected to other pastors, more connected to your denomination, what if you would just begin to meet monthly, hour and a half, just an hour and a half on say Saturday morning or on a weeknight after all the kids go to bed. You meet once a month online with 3 other bivocational pastors. Each of you gets 30 minutes of time. Well, what would you do for those 30 minutes with each person, that hour and a half total meeting, but what's going to happen with each person for those 30 minutes? Well, what you want to do is you want to ask coaching questions. We use Bob Logan's Barnabas questions. They're fairly simple and they're very encouraging, and yet they're deep enough it begins to pull out of that person what God is doing, and it allows you as the 3 bivocational pastors to relate at a deeper level. Those questions go like this. What are you celebrating? What's working for you? What challenges are you having right now? Well, it's not going so well. What is God doing in your life right now? What steps is God asking you to take in order to meet these challenges? How can we help? How can we pray for you? Those Barnabas questions will begin to help you relate and connect to one another at a deeper level. And if you're bivocational and you can't meet your cluster meetings or your area meetings or your district meetings, then find 2 other bivocational pastors and begin to meet with them, and then ask each other these questions. Do it monthly or every other month, and you'll begin to feel less and less isolated, and you'll begin to be encouraged, and you'll be encouraging someone else as they're doing bivocational work. So those are the challenges and some ways to meet those challenges. Let's close out our time by talking about 3 ways you can succeed at bivocational ministry for the long haul. Number 1, equip the saints. In the movement I'm from, it's called the Vineyard Movement. We have this little tagline, everybody gets to play. And what we mean by that is everybody gets to be a minister. That in our understanding of the scriptures, being a minister isn't just the pastor's role, but that every Christian is called to minister one to another, to be a servant to each other. And so everybody gets to play. One way you can succeed as a bivocational planter and pastor is learning how to equip the saints. Your role is to equip people to be able to do the work of ministry. Equipping the saints is not just great theology. It's not something that bivo pastors just talk about in theory. Bivocational pastors know equipping the saints is a necessity if they're going to make it for the long haul. So how could you start? What could you do to equip the saints right now? Well, first, your team, the team you're planting with or that you're doing work with right now, pastoring with, your team needs to hear about your capacity as a leader. They need to know how many hours you're able to give the plant. And that needs to be defined for them and to have some boundaries on that. And they also need to hear what you're going to give those hours to. And then anything past that has to be delegated to the team. Others have to be equipped to do that. So be talking with your team. I'm working this many hours in my mainstream job, and this is how many hours I'm giving the church, and this is what I'm giving those hours to. The other works of ministry, we need to equip others to do that. The other way you equip the saints is you equip people to do pastoral care. You're not going to be able to do all the pastoral care as a bivocational pastor. So you look for maybe 1 or 2 retired people that you could delegate that to, that you equip them to do it. Perhaps it's a Sunday school class that does that. In our church system, we look at small groups to provide pastoral care. In fact, a mantra at my church is, small groups are the primary place for pastoral care. So we look to groups to take care of one another. We actually believe the body of Christ has been equipped to heal itself, instruct itself, care for itself, and so we equip our group and our group leaders to do pastoral care. The third thing you're going to have to do if you're going to equip the saints is be intentional about leadership development. Now, this could be as simple as the slogan, if you're doing it alone, you're doing it wrong. So everything you're doing, whether you're going to a hospital visit or you're doing a funeral or you're preparing a message, perhaps part of your leadership development is just really informal and organic. You're just taking people with you everywhere. That's one way to equip the saints. But you'll also want to do some formal training. If you don't have the bandwidth to do that formal training, if you're blessed enough to have some other churches within driving distance, you can begin to share some of that formal training. But equipping the saints, part of that's going to be leadership development who helps handle the work of ministry you're doing. Another way to succeed at long-term bivocational planting and pastoring is to make sure you have intentional connections. That can be very difficult because you're trying to work a job, you're dealing with your family, you're working on your marriage, and you're doing ministry, and it's very difficult. So where do you find these life-giving, intentional connections? Well, you could obviously make friends within your own community, but one thing I've seen in lots of different small towns is pastors of different denominations getting together to help one another out, and these become life-giving connections. In my town, about 30 years ago, somebody started a pastor's prayer group, and it met for an hour each week. And when I started planting in my town, I began going to that meeting. And so for the last 17 years, I have went when I could, when I wasn't working another job, I would go to this time. My boss actually let me start going to the early morning meetings before work, and it was a little late each week, but they let me go. And it became a place of life for me. For an hour a week, pastors of Baptist churches and Methodist churches and Pentecostal churches and a Vineyard guy, we all get together and we share life. One of the guys is a United Brother and pastor, and he told me I would not still be doing this in this town if it was not for this group. So one place you can find intentional connections, particularly with peers, with people who are living the same life you're living, is local pastor groups. And I would encourage you not just to look at those groups as an event type group, but as a place that becomes a small group for pastors. And if that hasn't going on in your town, you could simply invite 2 or 3 pastors out for coffee and say, could we begin to meet and just get life from one another and have just fellowship and encouragement? Well, here's the last thing I want to talk about as far as how to do this for the long haul, and that's a sustainable rhythm. All church planters understand that church planting is tough, and it takes a lot to get it done in the first couple years, to get it off the ground. And so it's going to take a lot of hours, but you need to have an intentional rhythm. Oftentimes what happens to us church planners and pastor types is this. We hit it hard for 2 or 3 years, and we get used to that level of stress and energy, so eventually it doesn't feel like that much stress and that it's taking that much energy for us to do it. And so we get used to that, only to add more to our plate until it feels like stress and fatigue again. We get used to that, and then we just keep adding and adding and adding. We want to make sure we don't do that, because that'll eventually kill us, and it'll kill our families, and it'll kill us mentally, emotionally, and spiritually. So put into your life a sustainable rhythm, something that can go the long term. If you know it's going to take like 2 or 3 years really to get this thing rolling, well, at least have somebody you're accountable to in your life that is regularly asking you, like, okay, is it time to throttle back a little bit? What can you hand off? What can you give away? Because this rhythm is not sustainable. Back to my friend Dave Jacobs, who coaches 50 to 70 pastors a month. I talked to him, what are you seeing in bivocational planters and pastors that's sustainable? And he said, I usually talk to them to think about if they're going to give 20 or 30 hours to mainstream work, then give 20 to max 30 hours to church planting. You just can't do much more than 55, 60 hours a week over and over and over again for years and years and years at a time. You're going to have to figure a way that's sustainable. And he begins to break down the 20 hours that they give the church world, what that looks like. So this would be a sustainable rhythm. These are the things you could give yourself to. You need to have people time where you're meeting with people, gathering with people, whether that's one-on-one meetings or you're equipping the saints, the people in your church. You're going to have some admin time. And so part of your rhythm is going to be, most church planners don't think about, there's some administration that's going to need to be done. So carve out some time out of that 20 hours to do that. You're going to have creative thinking and spending time with God time. This isn't just necessarily quiet time or devotional time, although that's important in a sustainable rhythm. You're going to have to make that as a foundational point. But what I'm talking about here in church planting and pastoring is having time where you can just think with God. Like, God, what are you doing in my town? What are you doing in my church? You have to have some time there to think that out with Him and to have enough space in your heart to hear from Him. And then you're going to have some study time during the week. Now, most Bivos, especially if you've been trained at Bible college or seminary, we think we need 10 hours to prepare a sermon. You're going to have to figure a way out to cut that down. If you're spending 8 to 10 hours to develop a sermon in your bivocational, that's just too much time. You're going to have to systematically begin to cut that time down to maybe 3 hours or 4 hours. And I suspect that if you cut that down and then you asked your spouse or you asked other people in the church about the quality of your sermons, they're probably not going to notice a difference. I think Bible college and seminary at times gets us thinking we've got to have all this study time. But when you're Bivo, you don't have that. So you can begin to build a sustainable rhythm into your life. Part of that is some kind of a Sabbath. Can you do that one day a week? If you don't have Sabbath now, begin with something, whether it's half a day or an evening. It's not going to be church work. It's not going to be your mainstream work. Something. If you're going to be able to sustain this thing for the long time, you're going to have to take care of your soul. Because again, besides the presence of God in the midst of your church plant, you are your church plant's greatest asset. Well, let's wrap up this session by doing a quick review. I know as a bivocational planter, this isn't really a choice you're making. If you're going to small town USA, being bivocational is just necessary. But it's still a good thing. It has benefits. It reduces your need to get a bunch of financial aid before you go. The other thing it does is it helps you fit more quickly into the community. The community begins to see that you're contributing to the life of the community. And it also takes the financial pressure off of your church by being bivocational. Now, there's some challenges too, right? The current definition of church success is a challenge, but you're going to meet that by looking at obedience as your definition of success, that you're obeying God. And the other way you're going to meet that is you're going to look at your small town as a parish, that you're not just pastoring the people who show up on Sunday, you're pastoring the whole town. Fatigue and poor health are a challenge to you, but you can make that a big rock in your schedule, that you're going to take care of yourself, and you're going to use that time not only just by yourself, but you can use that time as discipleship time by inviting other people into your workout and exercise regimen, so that you're discipling as you're taking care of yourself. You're going to have less time for ministry. You're going to have less time for family. So you have to be very good about setting up some boundaries in your work week, that you are going to have family time that your spouse and your kids know this is just time for family. So put that in as a big rock. You're going to have a hard time connecting to denominational leaders or other pastoral peers. And so you can use something like an online bivocational triad meeting with other bivocational pastors to help meet that need. Then there are 3 things you can do to succeed long-term in bivocational pastoring. You can equip the saints. You can make one of your priorities as a bivocational pastor not to do everything yourself, but actually get other people to do the works of ministry, to equip them to do ministry. You can have intentional connections with other pastors in your town. That builds the life of the town, but it also gives you a place to have great relationships and to have relationships with peers who are living out the same life that you're living. And the final thing you can do is have a sustainable rhythm of life in ministry. You don't want to just do this for 2 years and flame out, or 5 years. You want to be in your small town for a long time, pastoring, seeing lives changed. And the way you do that is having a sustainable rhythm in your life. Thanks. Hope you found this video encouraging. God bless you.